Hello, welcome to the third episode of Anecdotal Evidence. I'm still following the same format and theme, so I'm going to tell you another story today. It kind of picks up where the last one left off with the UFO experience, because out of that experience, my good friend and I, who were partners in this endeavor for a few years, it started doing experiments in what in those days was commonly referred to as ESP, or extrasensory perception. So we had a few games that we played, which I highly recommend people, particularly young people with active mental capacities that haven't been completely dumbed down, to experiment with some of these a couple of these games. The two of them in particular are quite simple. For example, one of them was we would find an object. We would find an object, just a simple object that we could see and imagine, and one person would go outside the room and the other person would put that object in a bag and call the other person back in. Well, obviously the way to win the game was to guess what was in the bag. And of course there was rules and limitations. You only got 3 guesses and there was a time limit. And I could never do it. I failed every time, yet my friend, he was excellent at it. No matter what object I found to put in that bag, he would always guess it within the first couple of guesses. But not me. But then there's the other one, where it was similar in some ways. We pick one object that I sort of forgot that in the first experiment with the bag, that actually the person who went outside a room did not get to pick the object. Yeah, that probably makes more sense too. Okay, but with the second one, both people would identify the object, and one would go outside of the room and the other one would hide it somewhere in the room. And the way to win that game was to come inside with blindfold on and find the object without knocking a bunch of stuff over, tripping over your own feet, and also with a time limit. Now that I was good at. But that leads on to the next part, which was another thing that we were attempting to do in our extrasensory perception experiments, was astral projection. So we didn't really have any guides as to what astral projection was, so somehow we got this idea from somewhere to do this thing where you just concentrate on one object until your mind is clear of everything but that one object. Turns out that technique, quite often using a candle flame instead of another object, is the major technique for what's considered to be what's called transcendental meditation. So while we were trying to astral project, we were in fact entering into meditative states. And so that gets to the next part of the tale. I had been practicing this this meditation, trying to astral project, because I had actually moved away from this alpine town and I had moved to another state, and I wanted to communicate with my friend, and we had discussed, we actually called each other over the phone, we sent these little reel-to-reel tapes to each other, so we were in as much communication in basically using the technology we had at the time. And so we were only maybe a week or two behind each other in communication. I mean, that's kind of funny when we're only talking about immeasurable milliseconds between responses over the various networks in play right now. But so we were trying to contact each other through, quote unquote, the astral plane. So we were attempting to astral project. Now what happened to me was that the first 2 times that I did it, that I can actually remember, I had the same thing happen. I was like, I'd get to the point where all of the thoughts, the random firing thoughts had stopped, and I was just focused on the one object. And then I went through this, it's like going through a field or a membrane, and I was in the universe. I was like surrounded by galaxies and stars, and the unique perspective was that I seemed to have this 360 degree, not 360 degree, but spherical perception, and seeing the entire, everything that's around me from all points at once, and at the same time receiving all this information that was coming along with it. Now fortunately, it only lasted for just a tiny briefest split second, and then I was through, and I was in kind of like in a fog, and I had to go through this fog, and then at the other end of the fog I emerged into this place. And this place was like a huge hall. It was like a huge hall. The ceiling was so high you couldn't see it, and the furthest walls were so far away you couldn't see them. But it had a pretty solid floor, kind of like marble or something like that. And I witnessed off to my right there was like I always call it a grandstand, like the bleachers in high school, because it's what always tiers. There's tiers of seats, and 24 people of various races and ages, and even some races that weren't recognizable as what we would commonly recognize as Earth races, but they were all there. And the curious thing was that there was an avatar of me, kind of like an avatar, that was in a spotlight, and it was being questioned by these 24. And I was under the impression, because of something that was happening, like I was getting this multi-level communication going on. There was a spoken language which I did not understand. There was a written language with symbols that I did not understand. And these were like playing across my mind's eye, like what we would call a marquee. And then there was pictures that were also playing across that same strip in my mind's eye. And by the pictures I gathered that they were questioning my progress, basically. They were questioning my progress, and assuming it was my spiritual progress, that they were not questioning, but they wanted to know how I was doing. And that was pretty much the extent of the thing. I'd end up waking up sometime later, because I'd go from that state of meditation into a deep REM sleep, or just a sleep, and then I'd wake up maybe a half hour later, and I remember, except for it always ended in the same place, until one day in Southern California, I was up on the back porch of our house, my parents' house, and I decided to do this same meditation. And what occurred was identical to what I just told you, except that when I got through the fog, instead of there being this avatar of me standing in the spotlight being questioned, completely me, there was no avatar, it was all me. I was there, I was present in that place. And the 24 were sitting in their tiers, and they're having a conversation. I was getting the same readout across my head, and I gathered they were talking about me, but they were like, pretending I wasn't there, kind of. It was kind of rude in a way, but I was still in a state of, amazement and observation, so that idea didn't enter in my mind at the time. But after a period of time, it's like, it wasn't too long, it stopped. And this person sort of walked onto the stage, or walked into view. And this is the second time in my life that I run into the image and semblance, and like to believe the actual being of Yeshua, or Jesus. And he walked up, and he immediately spoke to the 24 on the tiers, and sort of admonished them for being, well, rude and not including me in their awareness of, like, ignoring I was there and stuff. And then he grabbed my hand, and he didn't really say anything. He just said, "Come with me," sort of. So I grabbed his hand and we started walking. And every step that we took was like from the beginning of time all the way to the end of my lifetime here now. And everything that was shown to me from the beginning of time all the way to the beginning of my life was like, after I experienced it, it was like immediately removed from my immediate memory. And it was explained to me that I would not remember it, but I would at some future point reawaken the information. But I did see quite clearly the progression of events that were going to happen in my lifetime. There wasn't a lot of specifics, but there were some. And I find it quite timely and appropriate at this point, even though this vision that I had was over 50 years ago. I find it quite pertinent because this is the story that unfolds. It was a lot like Revelation of John, although I hadn't read it yet in my life. Later on, when I was telling this very story, some people told me I should read Revelation. So there was what Revelation would call wars and rumors of wars, and famines and plagues and floods and droughts and fires. And of course, you know, we have at this point been living with this for so many years now. There's generations that have been born who don't have a point of reference before this stuff was happening, like an avalanche. So the details of the events were not specific, as I said. However, if you were to say do a quick search online of all the various disasters, wars, famines, diseases, earthquakes, fires, and other things that have occurred since, say, 1965, then I would say that probably most of those would fall into the criteria of what I witnessed. And in this vision, at the very end, there was a major event. And that was simply, there was great tension between China and actually the rest of the world. Remember, this was in 1965. And there was some sort of a plague that hit China that devastated her economy and her infrastructure, and yet one of the ways in which, in this vision that I saw, that China dealt with that was to try and actually invade the West, meaning that China sent out all of her their entire air force, and to land paratroopers on the west coast. The theory, I guess, was to take it over from the west coast to the east. So while these paratroopers were, well, there was something else that happened before this. I'm jumping ahead of myself. Before the invasion that China launched, there was this devastation of the plague, and it created a kind of almost like a zombie horde, only it was more like the Mongol horde from way back that our tribal ancestors talk about. Hordes of hungry, starving, very afraid people that leave China and head pretty much towards the Middle East, towards Israel. So it's like while this is happening, they launched this invasion with the aircraft. And what happens next is that without the American military forces, at least not in my vision, and Russia was involved in this too, and Israel, and without, none of them had this forewarning of the air invasion that was coming from China. I mean, at some point there must have been somebody in the Pacific that was picking it up, I'm sure, but at any rate the military was all engaged in the Middle East to try and deal with this horde. So what they decided to do in a joint effort was Israel, the United States, and Russia decided to nuke this horde. And it happened somewhere in relative what we consider to be the plains of Megiddo, and turning the entire desert there into a sea of sand, just fused it all into sand because there were so many nukes and heat that wiped out that horde that it fused the sand into glass. Meanwhile, they decided that wasn't good enough, and there was an earthquake that struck China. So China was like wrecked. They were wrecked, and Russia and United States and Israel decided to take advantage of it, and they nuked what was left of China. So pretty much China was almost completely wiped off the face of the earth. But before the nukes hit China, China was able to get off some of their nukes so that the entire global grid went down. And it was down for weeks. Now this part of the vision, I'm gone. In this vision, I had been taken up by motherships and taken somewhere else and been healed and cleansed and re-educated, retaught, informed, whatever you want to call it. And so all this stuff was like, I was seeing it going on even though I wasn't there, I was somewhere else. And the power grid went down, and it was like the cities, you know, you can just imagine what it was like in the cities in this vision, because we've seen pieces of it already, we're seeing it now. And so, you know, there's a lot of loss of life in those first few weeks, because food supplies ran out, power was out. I mean, it was horrible. But then, after a few weeks, somebody came onto the scene who had an entourage, had you know, their vehicles worked, they had access to fuel, they came from somewhere where the power was working, and ultimately they had their own army as well, and they pretty much turned the power back on, and this guy, who had a lot of charisma, assumed the leadership of the entire planet. Now this all occurred over a period of months, and he had control over the entire world. For the number is important, and I didn't know how important it was till later on in life, but the number of years that he ruled was 3.5. And then at the end of that time, all of us had been taken away, and there was a number of us, which I'm not quoting numbers because I can't really do that with any surety. There was just a number of us, several thousands of us that had been taken away in these motherships. They brought us back, and they let us off in groups of 7 in all the communities that were left of the world. And we just started walking around. We didn't talk to people, didn't talk to each other. We may have like sung some soft songs or something, but the only communication we pretty much did with people was through our eyes and smiling at them. So we walked around these cities, and as we walked around, all these people who'd pretty much been enthralled because they had to basically sell their soul in order to get the power turned on, they started to wake up. And this charismatic being who had done all this could sense that there was something wrong, because he had sort of like built this web that he was like the spider sitting on the web, so he could feel any of the vibrations that were happening in that web, and something was wrong because people were waking up. So he investigated, and they witnessed us doing this, and we weren't doing anything. Like I said, we weren't talking, we weren't telling people anything, we were just walking around. being. And this being could not find us because we were not connected in any way. So by deduction and mathematical algorithms, he deducted where we were by the places where we weren't, and aimed this big, bolt of mental mind blast out to just basically intended to fry all our brains. And we were all like a mirror, and it bounced right back. And that being was suddenly like transferred by his own negative power 90 degrees away from everything else. And then I found myself in an office, and my good friend was sitting behind a desk, and we were shaking hands goodbye. I was wishing him luck in his new endeavors in rebuilding the civilization on planet Earth, and he was wishing me luck on my journeys into parts unknown, because that's where I was going. And that was the end of that vision, and so that's the end of that story. Like I said, I'm not giving you conclusions. If you follow along the lines, sooner or later you might be able to connect the dots without my help. I'll tell you right now, it's not about me. So, if it's about me, it's about you. And that's as much of a clue as you're going to get for the moment. So I'm going to put a song into this one like the rest of them. But until next time, thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next episode of Anecdotal Evidence.
Oh, how is it that I could come out to here and be still, floating, and never hit the bottom, but just keep falling through, just relaxed and paying attention. All my two-dimensional boundaries were gone. I had lost to them badly, and I saw the world crumble, and I thought I was dead, but I found my senses still working. And as I continued to drop through the hole, I found all surrounding to show me the joy that just innocently is. Just be quiet and feel it around you. And I open my heart to the whole universe, and I found it was loving. And I saw the great blunder that my teachers had made, scientific delirium and madness. Well, I will keep falling as long as I live, or without ending. And I will remember the place that is now, that is ended before the beginning. And I open my heart to the whole universe, and found and I saw the great blunders that my teachers had made. Scientific delirium